Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot. Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places, choosing the soul that others overlook. When wealthy cattle baron Thaddeus Gray came to Cedar Falls, Judge Whitmore lined up his 4 daughters like flowers in a garden. Everyone expected him to pick the prettiest bloom, but Thaddeus chose Ruth, the plain sister who read books while her sisters preened. The whole town whispered and stared. What could he possibly see in her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust cloud on the horizon appeared first as a whisper, then grew into a declaration that would change Cedar Falls forever. From her perch in the oak tree behind the Whitmore mansion, Ruth watched the procession of riders approach town with the kind of quiet attention she gave to everything, observing while others performed, listening while others spoke. Thaddeus Gray's arrival came with the weight of legend preceding him. The silver pocket watch in his vest pocket, inherited from his father, had measured time across 3 states and countless cattle drives. It bore the scratches of a man who'd built an empire from nothing but determination and an understanding of the land that ran deeper than most men's understanding of their own hearts. Cedar Falls had been holding its breath for weeks, ever since word spread that the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory was coming to establish winter quarters near their town. Every family with marriageable daughters had spent those weeks in preparation, as if readying for a royal visit. The Whitmore household buzzed with particular intensity. Judge Harrison Whitmore stood on his wraparound porch, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who'd carved respectability from the raw frontier. His 4 daughters represented the crown jewels of his social achievement. Lydia, 22, possessed the kind of golden beauty that made grown men stumble over their own feet. Her cornflower blue eyes and perfectly arranged blonde curls had already broken 3 engagements, not from any fault of character, but because she'd been holding out for exactly this kind of opportunity. Anne, 20, wielded charm like a finely sharpened blade. Where Lydia was a painting to be admired, Anne was music to be enjoyed. Her laugh rang like silver bells across the courtyard, and her wit could disarm the sternest critic. She'd been practicing her most engaging smile in the mirror for days, timing each gesture for maximum effect. Margaret, 18, embodied grace and refinement. Trained in all the social graces expected of a judge's daughter, she could discuss literature, play the piano with skill that would make a conservatory proud, and manage a household with the efficiency of a field general. Her dark hair was always perfectly styled, her posture impeccable, her conversation appropriately measured and thoughtful. Then there was Ruth. At 19, Ruth occupied the peculiar position of being neither the oldest nor the youngest, neither the most beautiful nor the most accomplished in the traditional sense. Her brown hair refused to hold elaborate styles, preferring to escape from pins and fall in gentle waves around a face that could be called pleasant on generous days. Her nose bore a slight crook from a childhood fall, and her smile tilted just enough to the left to mark her as charmingly imperfect in a family that prized symmetry above all else. What Ruth possessed in abundance was a mind that devoured books the way her father devoured legal briefs. While her sisters practiced embroidery and watercolors, Ruth lost herself in volumes of poetry, philosophy, and adventure tales that transported her far beyond the confines of Cedar Falls. The town's small library considered her their most devoted patron, and the librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had taken to ordering books specifically with Ruth's interests in mind. This passion for reading had earned Ruth a reputation as the peculiar Whitmore daughter. In a society that valued feminine accomplishments in music, art, and household management, intellectual curiosity was viewed with suspicion, particularly in young women. Ruth had learned early to keep her thoughts to herself, expressing her observations through careful questions rather than bold statements. The irony wasn't lost on her that while her sisters prepared to dazzle their distinguished visitor with carefully rehearsed performances, She understood more about cattle ranching from her reading than any of them could glean from a dozen conversations. She devoured accounts of cattle drives, studied the economics of livestock management, and even read technical papers on breeding practices, not from any particular interest in becoming a rancher's wife, but simply because knowledge fascinated her. As the riders drew closer, Ruth could make out the lead figure, a man who sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Even from her distant perch, she could see that Thaddeus Gray possessed the kind of presence that made other men step aside without quite knowing why. His broad shoulders and weathered hands spoke of honest work, while his straight bearing suggested the kind of inner strength that came from facing down storms, both literal and metaphorical. The townspeople lined Main Street as the procession passed, children running alongside the horses, while their parents maintained more dignified positions on the wooden sidewalks. Shop owners emerged from their establishments, wiping flour-dusted hands on aprons or setting aside whatever task had occupied them to witness this momentous arrival. Mrs. Patterson, the town's most reliable source of gossip, had positioned herself strategically outside the general store, where she could observe everything while maintaining the pretense of sweeping her front steps. Her commentary, delivered in carrying whispers to anyone within earshot, provided running observations on everything from the quality of Mr. Gray's saddle leather to the probable cost of his horse's bridle. "That's a man who knows the value of good equipment," she noted approvingly. "Look at how those horses respond to him. That's not fear, that's respect. You can tell a lot about a man by how his animals behave around him." The Reverend Thompson stood outside his church, his black suit stark against the whitewashed walls, nodding approvingly at what he saw. A successful businessman who'd chosen to winter in their community represented not just economic opportunity, but validation that Cedar Falls was becoming the kind of place that attracted men of substance and quality. At the bank, President Morrison practically bounced on his toes with anticipation. The prospect of managing accounts for someone of Mr. Gray's rumored wealth had kept him awake at night, mentally calculating the benefits to his institution and, by extension, to the entire community. But it was at the Whitmore mansion that the true preparation had reached fever pitch. Judge Whitmore had spent the morning reviewing his most impressive legal victories, preparing conversational topics that would demonstrate his importance in territorial affairs. Mrs. Whitmore had supervised the preparation of their finest meal, ensuring that every detail from crystal to china would reflect the family's status and refinement. The four daughters had each approached the day with their own strategies. Lydia had chosen her most becoming dress, a powder blue confection that made her eyes sparkle like sapphires. Anne had practiced her most engaging stories, the ones that showed her wit without appearing too bold. Margaret had selected pieces for the piano that would demonstrate her musical accomplishment without seeming to show off. Ruth had simply chosen her newest dress, a modest green affair that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes and tucked a slim volume of poetry into her reticule, more from habit than any plan to impress their guest. As the riders finally turned up the circular drive leading to the Whitmore mansion, Ruth climbed down from her tree and smoothed her skirts. Through the parlor window, she could see her sisters making final adjustments to their appearances, each confident in her own appeal. She felt the familiar pang of being the afterthought, the daughter included in social gatherings more from family obligation than any expectation that she might contribute meaningfully to the proceedings. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel announced the moment that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. As Thaddeus Gray dismounted from his horse and handed the reins to one of his men, he glanced up at the impressive facade of the Whitmore home with the expression of a man who'd seen many such displays of wealth and status. What he carried in his weathered saddlebags, along with the tools of his trade, was a worn leather journal filled with sketches and private thoughts, a record of dreams deferred and hopes carefully guarded. The pages held observations about human nature gleaned from years of solitude, thoughts on the difference between worth and value, and scattered reflections on what truly mattered in building a life worth living. None of the watching townspeople could have guessed that this successful cattle baron carried within him a profound wariness of surface beauty, earned through hard experience. None could have suspected that he'd learned to look for qualities that didn't announce themselves, that he valued character over charm and substance over style. As Judge Whitmore stepped forward to greet his distinguished guest, the stage was set for an encounter that would challenge every assumption Cedar Falls had made about love, worth, and the nature of true attraction. The formal introduction evening at the Whitmore mansion unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, each participant knowing their role in the elaborate social performance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the mahogany dining table where Judge Whitmore's finest china created a tableau of refined elegance. The scent of roasted beef and fresh bread mingled with the delicate perfume worn by the four daughters, each positioned to maximize their individual appeal. Ruth clutched her book of poetry beneath the dining table, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The slim volume, bound in soft leather and filled with verses by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti, had been her constant companion through countless social gatherings where she felt more observer than participant. Tonight, however, the stakes seemed impossibly higher, and even her beloved poetry felt inadequate to calm her racing heart. Thaddeus Gray occupied the seat of honor at Judge Whitmore's right hand, his presence commanding the room's attention without apparent effort. He wore his finest suit, dark wool, that emphasized his broad shoulders, but Ruth noticed that his hands bore the permanent marks of honest labor that no amount of soap could completely erase. There was something reassuring about those hands, something that spoke of integrity and purpose. Lydia had positioned herself directly across from their guest, her golden hair catching the lamplight like spun sunshine. Her powder blue dress complemented her cornflower eyes perfectly, and she deployed her considerable beauty with the precision of a master strategist. Each smile, each tilt of her head, each flutter of her eyelashes had been calculated to maximum effect. "Mr. Gray," she said in her melodious voice, "I do hope our little town won't seem too quiet after the excitement of your cattle drives. We lead rather peaceful lives here in Cedar Falls." Her comment opened the conversational door exactly as intended, allowing Thaddeus to share stories of life on the range while she listened with precisely the right mixture of fascination and feminine delicacy. She gasped softly at tales of river crossings and storm-scattered herds, her eyes wide with admiration for his courage and resourcefulness. Anne, not to be outdone, waited for her moment to shine. When the conversation turned to territorial politics, she demonstrated her wit and intelligence with observations that were insightful without being unfeminine. Her laugh punctuated the evening at perfect intervals, creating an atmosphere of sophisticated enjoyment that showcased her social skills. "I find it remarkable," Anne said, leaning forward with animated interest, "how you've managed to build such success while maintaining your independence. So many businessmen seem bound by partnerships and complications, but you've charted your own course entirely." Her compliment was expertly crafted, acknowledging both his achievements and his autonomous nature, while positioning herself as someone who appreciated such qualities. Thaddeus nodded politely, though Ruth noticed that his responses, while courteous, lacked the warmth that genuine interest might have sparked. Margaret's contribution came through graceful efficiency in managing the social dynamics of the evening. She ensured that conversation flowed smoothly, that glasses never emptied, and that their guest felt properly attended without being overwhelmed. After dinner, she offered to play the piano, her performance of classical pieces demonstrating both technical skill and refined taste. Her rendition of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the parlor with haunting beauty, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced elegance. She'd chosen pieces that would showcase her accomplishment without appearing to show off, walking the careful line that separated impressive from ostentatious. Throughout these performances, Ruth remained largely silent, contributing only when directly addressed, and then with responses that were thoughtful but brief. She watched Thaddeus carefully, noting the way his eyes took in everything, not just the obvious displays of beauty and talent, but the smaller details that others might miss. She saw him observe how the servants were treated, how genuine the family's warmth seemed, how comfortable each daughter appeared in her own skin. When Margaret finished her musical presentation, Judge Whitmore rose with the satisfied air of a man about to close a successful negotiation. "Well, Mr. Gray, you've had the opportunity to meet all 4 of my daughters this evening. Each brings her own unique qualities to our family, and each would make a fine wife for a man of your standing and character." The room fell silent with anticipation. This was the moment every family member had been building toward, the culmination of weeks of preparation and an evening of carefully orchestrated charm. Lydia smoothed her skirts and tilted her chin to catch the lamplight on her profile. Anne arranged herself in a pose of elegant expectation. Margaret folded her hands in her lap with dignified composure. Ruth felt her book of poetry slip slightly in her sweaty palms and tightened her grip. She had no expectation of being chosen. That possibility seemed as remote as her dreams of traveling to the distant places she read about in her books. Yet something in Thaddeus's manner during the evening, the way his attention had seemed to catch on unexpected moments, made her heart beat faster than mere curiosity should explain. Thaddeus stood slowly, his movement deliberate and unhurried. His gaze swept across the 4 young women, lingering on each face with the careful consideration of someone making a decision of profound importance. Ruth found herself holding her breath, though whether from anticipation or anxiety she couldn't say. "Judge Whitmore," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "you have indeed raised 4 remarkable daughters. Each possesses qualities that any man would be fortunate to discover in a wife." He paused, and Ruth could feel the tension in the room intensify. Lydia's smile became more radiant, anticipating triumph. Ready to accept what seemed inevitable, Margaret maintained her composed expression, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. "However," Thaddeus continued, "if I may be so bold as to make my choice known tonight, I would be honored to request permission to court Miss Ruth." The silence that followed his words was so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway became audible. Ruth felt the book slip from her nerveless fingers and heard it hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the stunned quiet. Lydia's radiant smile froze, then crumbled into confusion. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Anne's mouth opened slightly, as if she'd been about to speak and forgotten what she intended to say. Her usual wit seemed to have abandoned her entirely in the face of this incomprehensible turn of events. Margaret's composure finally cracked, her eyebrows rising in an expression of polite bewilderment that couldn't quite hide her shock. Judge Whitmore himself seemed momentarily at a loss, his prepared responses suddenly irrelevant in the face of this unexpected development. "Ruth?" he repeated, as if he might have misheard. "You wish to court Ruth?" "I do," Thaddeus confirmed, his voice steady and certain. His gaze found Ruth's face and held it, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite interpret, a recognition that went beyond the superficial assessments that had defined her entire life. "Miss Ruth, if you would honor me with your permission, I would very much like the opportunity to know you better." Ruth felt heat flood her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment, confusion, and something else she couldn't name. She began, then stopped, uncertain what response was appropriate for a situation that had never appeared in any etiquette book she'd ever read. Mrs. Whitmore, who had remained diplomatically silent throughout the evening's proceedings, stepped forward with the grace of a woman accustomed to managing social complications. "Mr. Gray, you have certainly surprised us all. Ruth, dear, perhaps you'd like to step outside onto the veranda for some fresh air while we all collect ourselves." The suggestion provided escape from a situation that had become almost unbearably intense. Ruth stood on shaking legs, retrieved her fallen book, and made her way toward the French doors that led to the garden, acutely aware that every eye in the room followed her movement. Once outside in the cool evening air, she pressed her back against the stone wall of the house and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Through the windows, she could hear the buzz of urgent conversation, her family's voices raised in animated discussion of this unprecedented development. Why had he chosen her? The question circled in her mind like a persistent moth around a flame. She possessed none of the obvious qualities that men typically sought in wives. She wasn't beautiful like Lydia, charming like Anne, or accomplished like Margaret. What could a successful, handsome man like Thaddeus Gray possibly see in someone like her? The answer, she realized, would require courage to discover. And for the first time in her life, Ruth Whitmore found herself curious enough about her own worth to risk finding out. The days following Thaddeus's unexpected announcement passed in a blur of whispered conversations and barely concealed stares. Ruth found herself at the center of attention for the first time in her life, and the experience proved far more uncomfortable than she'd ever imagined. Every trip to the general store, every walk through town, every Sunday service became an exercise in enduring the curious gazes and hushed speculation of neighbors who couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Patterson, never one to keep her opinions to herself, had taken it upon herself to become the unofficial chronicler of this peculiar courtship. Her observations, delivered with the authority of someone who'd witnessed 3 decades of Cedar Falls romances, followed Ruth wherever she went. "I just don't understand it, Mrs. Patterson confided to anyone within earshot at the Mercantile. "That man could have his pick of beauties from here to San Francisco, and he chooses the plainest Whitmore girl. There must be something we don't know about him, some defect of character or judgment that isn't immediately apparent." These comments, invariably delivered just loudly enough for Ruth to overhear, struck at the heart of her deepest insecurities. Late at night, alone in her room, she found herself standing before her mirror, searching for some hidden quality that might explain Thaddeus's choice. What she saw reflected back was the same unremarkable face that had always looked back at her pleasant enough, but certainly nothing that should inspire a man to overlook more obvious attractions. The situation within the Whitmore household had become equally challenging. Lydia, accustomed to being the center of male attention since childhood, struggled to comprehend how she'd been passed over for her bookish younger sister. Her confusion manifested in increasingly cutting remarks delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ruth, dear," she said over breakfast one morning, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you simply must tell me your secret. What enchantment did you cast to capture Mr. Gray's attention so completely? I'm sure Anne and Margaret would love to learn your methods for future reference." Anne, whose wit had always been her weapon of choice, employed a different strategy. Her comments came wrapped in apparent concern, making them more difficult to deflect or address directly. "I do worry about you, Ruth," she said as they sat in the parlor after dinner. "This sudden attention from such an important man, it must be overwhelming for someone of your temperament. I hope you won't be hurt when he comes to his senses and realizes his mistake. Men can be so impulsive in their decisions, particularly when they're far from home and perhaps feeling lonely." These barbed observations found their mark precisely because they echoed Ruth's own doubts. She had spent 19 years believing herself to be the least remarkable member of her family, and a few days of unexpected courtship couldn't immediately erase a lifetime of assuming she would always be overlooked. Margaret, perhaps the kindest of the 3 sisters, struggled with her own disappointment while attempting to maintain family harmony. Her approach was more subtle, but no less painful, a series of meaningful glances and gentle corrections that suggested Ruth was somehow mishandling this opportunity that should have belonged to someone more suited to it. "Perhaps you might consider allowing me to help you with your hair tomorrow," Margaret offered as they prepared for bed. Mr. Gray is calling again, and you want to look your very best. A few curls might soften your features quite nicely. Even these well-intentioned suggestions reinforced Ruth's feeling that she was fundamentally inadequate for the role she'd unexpectedly been asked to play. Every offer of help implied that significant improvement was both necessary and possible, that she was a rough draft of femininity that required extensive editing to be worthy of Thaddeus's continued interest. Judge Whitmore found himself caught between pride in his daughter's unexpected success and confusion about how it had occurred. His attempts to counsel Ruth proved awkward and somewhat bewildering to both of them. "Ruth," he said, cornering her in his study one afternoon, "I want you to understand the significance of Mr. Gray's interest. This is an opportunity that could secure your future in ways that extend far beyond our family's current circumstances. I trust you won't do anything to discourage his attentions through excessive displays of your—" He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing, "intellectual pursuits. Men prefer their wives to be intelligent, certainly, but not so much so that they feel challenged or diminished." Mrs. Whitmore, ever the diplomat, tried to navigate the charged atmosphere with grace while managing her own surprise at this turn of events. Her coaching focused on practical matters, proper conversation topics, appropriate dress, and the delicate art of encouraging a suitor without appearing too eager. "Remember, dear," she advised during one of their private conversations, "a lady should be like a lovely song, pleasant to experience, but not so complex that it requires too much effort to appreciate. Mr. Gray is clearly a man of substance, but he's also a man accustomed to straightforward dealings. Don't overwhelm him with too many of your ideas all at once." Through all of this well-meaning but undermining advice, Ruth began to feel as though she was being asked to disappear entirely, to become an acceptable version of herself that bore little resemblance to the person she actually was. The irony wasn't lost on her that in gaining a suitor, she seemed to be losing herself. It was during this period of mounting pressure and self-doubt that Thaddeus arrived for his third formal call, carrying with him a small object wrapped in brown paper. His gift was neither expensive nor elaborate, a hand-carved wooden horse, no larger than his palm, created with the careful attention to detail that spoke of winter evenings spent working with patient hands. "I made this during my last cattle drive," he explained as Ruth unwrapped the simple carving. "There's something about working with wood that helps a man think clearly about what matters. I thought you might appreciate it." The horse was beautiful in its simplicity, every line clean and purposeful, the proportions perfect despite its modest size. Ruth turned it over in her hands, noting the smoothness of the wood and the care evident in every detail. It was the kind of gift that spoke to character rather than wealth, to thoughtfulness rather than obligation. "It's wonderful," she said, meaning it completely. "Did you carve many of these during your travels?" "Just this one," Thaddeus replied. "I don't usually have the patience for such work, but something about this piece kept calling to me. Every time I picked up my knife, I found myself thinking about permanence, about creating something that would last." The implications of his words weren't lost on either of them. This wasn't a casual trinket, but a considered investment of time and thought. Ruth found herself studying his face, searching for the motivation behind such deliberate care. "Mr. Gray," she said, gathering courage from some hidden reserve she hadn't known she possessed, "I must ask you something that's been troubling me. Why did you choose me? Not because I'm fishing for compliments, but because I genuinely don't understand. You could have chosen any of my sisters, each of whom possesses qualities that would make her an asset to any man fortunate enough to win her affection. What is it that you see in me that I cannot see in myself?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, turning her question over in his mind with the same careful consideration he might give to a difficult business decision. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Miss Ruth," he said finally, "I've learned that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that don't announce themselves loudly. Your sisters are indeed lovely and accomplished, but you possess something rarer. You listen more than you speak, you think before you act, and you see the world with curiosity rather than judgment. These are qualities that build lasting partnerships, not just pretty courtships. His answer was both more and less than she'd expected, offering insight while raising new questions. As he took his leave that afternoon, Ruth clutched the wooden horse and wondered if she possessed the courage to discover whether his faith in her hidden qualities was justified. 2 weeks into their courtship, Thaddeus arrived at the Whitmore home, carrying a leather portfolio that had seen considerable wear from years of travel. When Ruth met him in the parlor for their afternoon visit, he spread its contents across the mahogany table with the reverence of someone sharing sacred artifacts. The map of his ranch emerged first, hand-drawn, with careful attention to topographical details that spoke of intimate knowledge earned through countless hours in the saddle. "This is what I've built over the past 12 years, he said, his weathered finger tracing the boundaries of his property. 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana Territory, with water rights that extend to 3 natural springs and 2 creek systems." Ruth leaned forward, immediately drawn to the careful notations and detailed sketches that covered every inch of the map. Where another woman might have seen merely lines and measurements, she recognized the poetry of purposeful planning. Each pasture was marked not just for size, but for seasonal capacity, grass quality, and proximity to water sources. "You've planned for rotation," she observed, noting the numbered sections and seasonal indicators. "The cattle never overgraze any single area because you move them through a systematic pattern that allows the land to recover." Thaddeus looked up sharply, surprise evident in his expression. In all his conversations with potential business partners, few had grasped so quickly the sophisticated management system that made his operation profitable, where others struggled merely to survive. "How did you—" he began, then paused as understanding dawned. "You're reading." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly self-conscious about revealing the extent of her knowledge. "I've read extensively about agricultural management and livestock science, not because I expected to need such information, but because the principles fascinated me. The way successful ranchers work with natural systems rather than against them. It's like watching someone conduct an orchestra where every instrument is a force of nature." The metaphor resonated with Thaddeus in ways Ruth couldn't have anticipated. For years, he'd struggled to explain to others why he approached ranching as both science and art, why he spent hours observing weather patterns and grass growth cycles while his competitors focused solely on market prices and immediate profits. "That's exactly right," he said, his voice carrying genuine excitement. "Most men see cattle ranching as a matter of buying low, selling high, and hoping Mother Nature cooperates. But the successful operations understand that we're partners with the land, not masters of it." He began sharing stories of his early years, when inexperience and overconfidence had nearly cost him everything. Ruth listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel understood in ways he'd forgotten were possible. When he described the devastating winter that killed nearly half his herd, she didn't offer empty consolations, but asked thoughtful questions about how he'd rebuilt and what lessons had shaped his current practices. "The hardest part wasn't the financial loss," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "It was realizing that my pride had made me ignore warning signs that more experienced ranchers would have recognized immediately. I'd been so determined to prove I could succeed without help that I nearly destroyed everything I'd worked to build." "Pride can be expensive," Ruth observed quietly. "But sometimes it takes losing something important to learn the difference between confidence and arrogance." Her comment carried weight that suggested personal experience with difficult lessons, though she didn't elaborate. Thaddeus found himself curious about what challenges had shaped her understanding, what losses had taught her wisdom that seemed beyond her years. As their conversation continued, Ruth's natural intelligence and genuine interest transformed what might have been a polite social visit into something approaching a business consultation. She asked about his breeding program, his methods for evaluating potential grazing land, and his strategies for dealing with the unpredictable cattle market that had ruined many smaller operators. "Have you considered diversifying beyond cattle?" she asked at one point. "Some ranchers are finding success with sheep or horses, particularly those with access to railroad transportation for broader markets." "I've thought about it," Thaddeus admitted. "The challenge is finding the right balance between expansion and overextension. Growth for its own sake can be as dangerous as stagnation. Perhaps the answer lies in partnerships rather than expansion," Ruth suggested. "Cooperative arrangements with other ranchers who specialize in different livestock could provide diversification benefits without requiring additional land or capital investment." The sophistication of her suggestion impressed him deeply. While her sisters had been trained to make pleasant conversation about weather and social events, Ruth engaged with complex economic concepts as naturally as if she'd spent years managing agricultural investments. Their discussion was interrupted by Anne's entrance, her bright smile not quite concealing her displeasure at finding them bent over ranch maps and financial projections like business partners rather than romantic interests. "My goodness," she said with forced lightness, "you two look as serious as Judge Whitmore reviewing a difficult case. Surely courtship should involve more pleasant topics than cattle management." Ruth immediately began gathering the papers, her moment of confident engagement evaporating under her sister's implied criticism. But Thaddeus caught her hand, gently preventing her from clearing away the maps. "Actually," he said, addressing Anne but keeping his eyes on Ruth, "I find Miss Ruth's insights invaluable. She understands aspects of ranch management that escape many experienced cattlemen. It's refreshing to discuss my work with someone who appreciates both its challenges and possibilities." Anne's smile became more strained. "How unusual," she managed. "Most gentlemen prefer to keep business matters separate from their personal relationships. I'm sure Ruth is flattered by your confidence in her intellect, even if such topics might be considered rather inappropriate for a young lady." The criticism stung because it echoed warnings Ruth had heard throughout her life that her interests were unfeminine, that intelligent women made men uncomfortable, that she should hide her knowledge rather than risk appearing too bold or opinionated. But Thaddeus's response surprised both sisters. "Miss Anne," he said with quiet firmness, "I've found that intelligence is never inappropriate, regardless of gender. In fact, I consider it essential in a life partner. A successful ranch requires two people working together toward common goals, not one person making decisions while the other provides decorative support." His words represented a radical departure from conventional thinking about marriage roles, particularly in frontier society, where traditional gender divisions often meant survival itself. Anne retreated in confusion, unprepared to argue against sentiments that challenged everything she'd been taught about attracting and keeping a husband. After Anne's departure, Ruth and Thaddeus continued their conversation with increased intimacy. The map spread between them became more than a business document. It represented shared dreams and the possibility of a future built on mutual respect and understanding. "When I first drew these boundaries," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability, "I imagined myself growing old alone on this land. Success meant financial security and professional respect, nothing more. I never considered that it might be more fulfilling to build something alongside someone who understood not just what I was doing, but why it mattered." Ruth studied the map with new eyes, seeing not just grazing land and water rights, but the foundation for a life that could honor both practical necessity and deeper purpose. For the first time since his unexpected courtship began, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the confines of Cedar Falls, a future where her mind would be valued as highly as her heart. "It's a beautiful dream," she said softly, meaning far more than the ranch itself. The following week brought an unexpected opportunity for privacy when Thaddeus suggested they take a chaperoned walk through the countryside surrounding Cedar Falls. Mrs. Whitmore eager to encourage the courtship despite her continuing bewilderment at its unusual nature, agreed to accompany them at a discreet distance that would preserve propriety while allowing for genuine conversation. Ruth led them along a winding path that followed Cedar Creek to her favorite reading spot, a natural clearing beneath an ancient oak tree where wildflowers grew in careless abundance. The location had been her refuge since childhood, a place where she could escape family expectations and lose herself in whatever book had captured her imagination. She'd never shared this secret sanctuary with anyone, but something about Thaddeus's respectful attention to her thoughts made her want to reveal this piece of herself. "This is where I come to think," she said, settling herself on a fallen log that had served as her reading bench for years. "When the house becomes too full of voices and obligations, when I need space to hear my own thoughts clearly." Thaddeus examined the clearing with the same careful attention he'd given to ranch maps, noting the way afternoon light filtered through leaves to create natural reading light, how the sound of running water would mask conversations from curious ears, how the location provided both beauty and solitude. "It's perfect," he said simply. "Everyone needs a place where they can be completely themselves without apology or explanation." Ruth found herself studying his weathered face, noting the way his expression softened when he looked at the wildflowers scattered around their feet. On impulse, she picked a small purple bloom, a hardy wildflower that grew throughout the territory, and offered it to him. "It's nothing special," she said, suddenly self-conscious about the gesture, "just a common prairie flower. But I've always thought they were beautiful in their simplicity, the way they thrive without cultivation or care, finding beauty in unexpected places." Thaddeus accepted the pressed wildflower with the reverence another man might show for an expensive gift. He studied its delicate petals and sturdy stem, understanding immediately why this particular flower had spoken to her. Like Ruth herself, it possessed a quiet beauty that revealed itself only to those who took time to notice. "I'll treasure it," he said, carefully tucking the flower into his vest pocket near his father's watch. Sometimes the most precious things are the ones that don't demand attention, the ones that reward patient observation rather than immediate admiration. His words carried deeper meaning that made Ruth's heart race with possibility. Was he speaking only of flowers? Or was this his way of telling her that he saw something valuable in her quiet nature, her tendency to bloom in solitude rather than seek the spotlight? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Judge Whitmore appeared on horseback, his expression troubled in a way that immediately put both Ruth and Thaddeus on alert. "Mr. Gray," the judge called as he dismounted, "I apologize for interrupting your outing, but I felt you should be aware of some concerning developments in town." Thaddeus stood, instinctively positioning himself between Ruth and whatever unpleasant news her father carried. "What's happened?" "There's been talk," Judge Whitmore said carefully. "Some of the townspeople are questioning your motives in courting Ruth. They're suggesting that perhaps your choice reflects some hidden defect in your character or judgment, that no man of sound mind would overlook more obvious attractions unless something was fundamentally wrong with him." Ruth felt her stomach clench with humiliation. The whispered conversations she'd tried to ignore had apparently escalated into open speculation about Thaddeus's mental state and moral character. Her courtship, instead of elevating her status, was becoming a source of embarrassment for both of them. "I see," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. "And what is your assessment of this situation, Judge Whitmore?" "I believe the gossip reflects poorly on those who spread it rather than on you," Judge Whitmore replied diplomatically. "However, I thought you should be prepared for potential social complications that might arise from your unconventional choice." Ruth wanted to sink into the earth and disappear. The implication was clear. Her worthlessness as a romantic partner was so obvious that Thaddeus's interest in her could only be explained by some fundamental flaw in his character or judgment. She was not just inadequate. She was so inadequate that choosing her raised questions about the chooser's sanity. But Thaddeus's response surprised both father and daughter. Instead of defensive explanations or social maneuvering, he turned to Ruth with an expression of fierce protectiveness. "Miss Ruth," he said, "I want you to understand something clearly. The opinions of people who judge worth by superficial standards are of no consequence to me. I've spent 12 years building success through my own judgment and determination, and I won't begin doubting myself now because others lack the wisdom to recognize quality when they see it." His declaration was both a defense of his choice and an affirmation of her value that left Ruth speechless. No one had ever defended her so completely, so publicly, or with such unwavering conviction. Furthermore, Thaddeus continued, addressing Judge Whitmore directly, "I want it clearly understood that my courtship of your daughter represents the best decision I've made since arriving in Cedar Falls. Miss Ruth possesses intelligence, integrity, and genuine character that are far more valuable than conventional beauty or social accomplishment. Any man fortunate enough to earn her affection would be gaining a partner capable of building a meaningful life together." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, clearly moved by the sincerity and conviction in Thaddeus's voice. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Gray. Ruth is indeed special, though I confess I hadn't expected others to recognize her particular qualities quite so readily." The admission that even her own father had been surprised by someone valuing her should have stung, but Ruth found herself focused instead on Thaddeus's unwavering certainty about her worth. For the first time in her life, someone saw her clearly and chose her anyway, not despite her differences, but because of them. As they walked back toward town, Mrs. Whitmore maintaining her chaperoning distance, Ruth found courage to voice the question that had been growing in her heart. "Mr. Gray," she said quietly, "may I ask what you see when you look at me? I don't mean to be forward, but I've spent 19 years believing myself to be the least remarkable member of my family. Your confidence in my value is so complete that I wonder if perhaps you see something I've never recognized in myself." Thaddeus was quiet for several steps, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that his answer would shape how she saw herself for years to come. "When I look at you, Miss Ruth," he said finally, "I see someone who has learned to find contentment in her own company because she's developed the kind of inner life that makes solitude meaningful rather than lonely. I see someone who asks thoughtful questions because she genuinely wants to understand, not because she wants to appear clever. I see someone who would rather be respected than admired, who values substance over style, who would build a life based on authentic connection rather than social obligation." He paused, then continued with even greater intensity. "But most importantly, I see someone who has been overlooked so consistently that she's learned to value herself according to others' assessments rather than her own merit. And I find myself wanting to spend whatever time you'll allow me proving that their assessments have been profoundly, tragically wrong." Ruth felt tears threaten as the weight of his words settled over her. The pressed wildflower in his pocket had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility that beauty could be found in unexpected places, that worth didn't require universal recognition to be real, and that sometimes the most valuable things were those that revealed themselves slowly to patient observers. As they approached the Whitmore mansion, Ruth realized that her feelings for Thaddeus had evolved beyond gratitude for his attention or confusion about his motives. She was beginning to love him not just for choosing her, but for helping her discover that she was worth choosing. The threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door of Thaddeus's hotel room while he slept. The paper was cheap, the handwriting deliberately disguised, but the message was clear and chilling in its directness. "A man of your standing deserves better than damaged goods. Miss Ruth Whitmore will bring you nothing but shame and regret. Choose wisely before it's too late." Thaddeus stared at the anonymous correspondence, his jaw tightening with controlled anger. The cowardice of unsigned threats offended him almost as much as their content. In 12 years of business dealings, he'd learned to identify the difference between legitimate warnings and the malicious meddling of those who sought to profit from others' doubts. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, not from any intention to heed its advice, but because he understood that anonymous threats often escalated when ignored. Someone in Cedar Falls was sufficiently troubled by his courtship of Ruth to risk potential legal consequences, and that level of opposition suggested deeper currents than mere social disapproval. Meanwhile, Ruth struggled with her own mounting anxieties as the weight of public scrutiny continued to intensify. Every appearance in town brought fresh reminders of how unusual her situation had become. Shop owners who had previously treated her with polite indifference now watched her with the kind of fascinated attention usually reserved for traveling exhibitions or natural curiosities. The worst moment came during Sunday service, when Reverend Thompson chose to deliver a sermon on the topic of divine providence and unexpected blessings. While his intentions were undoubtedly kind, his repeated references to how God sometimes revealed his wisdom through surprising choices made Ruth feel like a biblical example rather than a congregant seeking spiritual guidance. "The Lord often chooses the humble vessel over the ornate chalice," the Reverend proclaimed, his eyes finding Ruth in the third pew, "for he values the purity of what lies within rather than the beauty of outward appearance." Ruth felt heat flood her face as whispers rippled through the congregation. Being compared to a humble vessel in front of the entire community was mortifying enough, but the implication that she represented God's preference for inner virtue over outer beauty felt like being damned with extremely public praise. After service, as the family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner, the tension that had been building within the Whitmore household finally erupted. Lydia, who had maintained a facade of gracious acceptance for weeks, could no longer contain her bewilderment and resentment. "I simply don't understand any of this," she said, her usual composed demeanor cracking to reveal genuine distress. "Ruth, I don't mean to be cruel, but you must acknowledge how strange this entire situation has become. Mr. Gray could marry into any family in the territory, and yet he's chosen someone who has never shown the slightest interest in being a wife or managing a household." "Lydia," Mrs. Whitmore warned, sensing dangerous territory. "No, Mother. Someone needs to say what we're all thinking. Ruth has spent 19 years with her nose buried in books, showing no interest in domestic accomplishments or social graces. Now, suddenly, she's expected to become the wife of a wealthy rancher? It's not fair to anyone, not to Mr. Gray, who deserves a proper wife, and not to Ruth, who's being thrust into a role she's completely unprepared for." Anne joined the attack with her characteristic precision. "Perhaps the real question is whether Ruth truly wants this marriage, or if she's simply flattered by the attention. It would be kinder to everyone if she stepped aside gracefully, rather than allowing this charade to continue until Mr. Gray realizes his mistake." Margaret, always the diplomat, tried to soften her sister's assault. "What Lydia and Anne mean is that we're concerned about your happiness, Ruth. Marriage to a man like Mr. Gray would require certain social obligations and domestic responsibilities that might not suit your temperament. Perhaps you should consider whether this life would truly make you happy." Judge Whitmore, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation, finally voiced his own concerns. "Girls, that's quite enough. However, I must admit that some aspects of this courtship trouble me as well. Ruth, you must understand that marriage is a practical arrangement as much as a romantic one. Mr. Gray will expect certain things from a wife: social skills, household management, the ability to entertain his business associates appropriately. These are areas where your sisters have considerably more experience and natural aptitude." The accumulated weight of their doubts and criticisms crashed over Ruth like a collapsing dam. Every insecurity she'd tried to suppress, every moment of self-doubt she'd attempted to overcome, came flooding back with renewed force. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was being selfish in accepting Thaddeus's attention when she had so little to offer in return. That evening, as she sat in her room staring at the wooden horse he'd carved for her, Ruth found herself seriously considering whether the kindest thing she could do for everyone, including Thaddeus, would be to end their courtship before it caused further embarrassment for both families. The next morning brought another blow to her fragile confidence. Walking past the millinery shop, she overheard a conversation between two women she'd known since childhood. "It's really quite sad when you think about it," Mrs. Henderson was saying to Mrs. Morrison. "That poor man is so lonely and desperate for companionship that he's convinced himself he's in love with the first woman who showed him any kindness. Mark my words, once the novelty wears off and he realizes what he's gotten himself into, he'll be looking for a way out of this engagement." "Perhaps someone should warn him, Mrs." Morrison replied. "It would be a mercy to both of them. Ruth Whitmore is a sweet enough girl, but she's about as suited to be a cattle baron's wife as I am to be a duchess. The whole situation is headed for disaster." Ruth hurried past before they could notice her, but their words followed her home like gathering storm clouds. By the time Thaddeus arrived for his afternoon call, she had worked herself into a state of barely controlled panic. "Mr. Gray," she said before he could even settle into the parlor chair, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me with complete honesty. Do you truly believe I would make you a suitable wife, or are you perhaps allowing loneliness and kindness to cloud your judgment about my capabilities?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, but the pain in her voice told him that this was no moment for diplomatic reassurances. She was asking for truth, not comfort, and she deserved nothing less than his complete honesty. "Miss Ruth," he said carefully, "what has prompted this question? Has something happened to make you doubt my sincerity?" "Everything has happened," she replied, her composure finally cracking. "The whole town thinks you've taken leave of your senses. My own family believes I'm unsuited for marriage to someone of your standing. Even I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps everyone else sees something I'm too proud or too foolish to acknowledge." She took a shaking breath before continuing. "I don't know how to be the wife of a wealthy rancher. I don't know how to manage large households or entertain important guests or navigate the social obligations that would come with such a position. What if my sisters are right? What if I'm being selfish in accepting your attention when someone else could serve you so much better?" Thaddeus listened to her catalogue of fears and self-doubts with growing understanding. The pressure of constant scrutiny and criticism had finally worn down her newfound confidence, leaving her vulnerable to all the old insecurities that had shaped her self-perception for years. "Ruth," he said, using her first name without the formal address for the first time, "may I tell you what I see when I imagine my future? I see a woman intelligent enough to understand the challenges of ranch management, practical enough to find solutions to problems that would baffle others, and strong enough to build something meaningful alongside me. I see someone who would value our partnership more than our social status, who would measure our success by what we accomplished together rather than how others perceived us." He paused, then continued with gentle intensity. "But most importantly, I see someone brave enough to be herself in a world that constantly pressures women to disappear into acceptable roles. That kind of authenticity is rarer and more valuable than any social accomplishment." Ruth felt tears threatening as she absorbed his words. "But what if I disappoint you? What if I prove incapable of being the partner you deserve?" "Then we'll learn together," Thaddeus replied simply. "Marriage isn't a performance where one person must be perfect while the other judges their adequacy. It's a partnership where two people help each other become better than they could be alone." The threatening letter remained hidden in his desk drawer, but its poison had already begun to spread through Ruth's doubts and fears. As Thaddeus took his leave that afternoon, both of them carried new uncertainties about whether their love could survive the weight of a world determined to prove them wrong. The faded photograph had lived in Thaddeus's saddlebags for 3 years, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from rain and dust during countless cattle drives. He'd carried it through storms that scattered herds across 3 counties, through river crossings that claimed lesser men, through lonely nights when the weight of solitude threatened to crush his spirit entirely. The image showed a young woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile, not conventionally beautiful, but possessed of the kind of quiet grace that revealed itself slowly to careful observers. Her name had been Sarah Mitchell, and she had died of fever just 2 months before their planned wedding, taking with her all of Thaddeus's assumptions about what mattered in choosing a life partner. The experience had taught him lessons about love and loss that no amount of business success could equal, lessons that had shaped every decision he'd made since leaving Colorado Territory 3 years ago. Now, sitting in his hotel room with Ruth's tearful questions from the afternoon still echoing in his memory, Thaddeus knew the time had come to share the truth that explained his unconventional choice. The anonymous threats and social pressure were testing Ruth's faith in herself, and she deserved to understand why he saw her so clearly when others remained blind to her worth. The next morning he arrived at the Whitmore home earlier than usual, asking Judge Whitmore for permission to speak with Ruth privately in the garden. The gravity of his manner convinced the judge to grant the unusual request, though Mrs. Whitmore insisted on remaining within sight, if not within hearing distance. Ruth met him beneath the rose arbor where they'd shared their first meaningful conversations, her face pale with the strain of sleepless nights spent questioning everything she'd begun to believe about herself. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, but her posture spoke of someone preparing to receive difficult news. "Ruth," Thaddeus began, then paused, gathering courage for revelations he'd shared with no other living soul. "Yesterday you asked if I was allowing loneliness to cloud my judgment about your suitability as a wife. Before I answer that question, I need to share something about my past that will help you understand why I see you so clearly." He withdrew the oiled cloth package from his vest pocket, unwrapping it with reverence that spoke of countless private moments spent studying its contents. The photograph emerged slowly, its edges worn from handling, but the image still clear enough to capture the essence of the woman it portrayed. "Her name was Sarah," Thaddeus said, offering Ruth the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. "We were to be married in Colorado Territory 3 years ago, but she contracted fever during an unusually harsh winter and died before our wedding could take place." Ruth studied the image with growing understanding. Sarah Mitchell possessed the same quiet beauty that Ruth had always considered unremarkable in herself, the kind of face that revealed its attractions slowly, through expression and character, rather than immediate visual impact. She could see why this woman had captured Thaddeus's heart, and she could see why losing her would have shaped his understanding of what truly mattered in a life partner. "She was beautiful," Ruth said quietly, meaning it completely. "Not in the way that demands immediate attention, but in the way that grows more lovely the longer you look." "Yes," Thaddeus agreed, his voice rough with memory. "And she was intelligent, practical, and possessed of the kind of inner strength that made everyone around her feel more capable, more worthwhile. Sarah saw the world with curiosity rather than judgment, valued substance over appearance, and had the courage to be herself, even when society suggested she should be someone else entirely." Ruth handed the photograph back carefully, understanding dawning in her expression. "I remind you of her." "At first, perhaps," Thaddeus admitted, "but that's not why I chose to court you, Ruth. What drew me to Sarah, and what draws me to you, are qualities that exist independent of any comparison. You both possess something rare, the ability to see clearly without cynicism, to think independently without arrogance, to remain true to yourselves without apology." He paused, studying her face for signs of understanding or rejection. "Losing Sarah taught me that conventional beauty fades, that social accomplishments mean nothing during the hard seasons of life, That what sustains a marriage through decades isn't charm or grace, but character and compatibility. When I met your family, I recognized in you the same qualities that had made Sarah extraordinary. Ruth felt tears gathering as the weight of his revelation settled over her. So I am a replacement for someone you lost, a consolation prize that reminds you of what you can never have again. No, Thaddeus said with fierce certainty. You are not a replacement for anyone, Ruth. You are yourself, unique, valuable, worthy of love in your own right. Sarah's death didn't teach me to settle for lesser versions of what I'd lost. It taught me to recognize authentic worth when I found it again. He reached for her hands, holding them gently but firmly. What I felt for Sarah was first love, pure and untested by real challenges. What I'm beginning to feel for you is deeper, more mature, built on genuine understanding rather than romantic idealization. I'm not trying to recapture my past, Ruth. I'm trying to build a future with someone who shares my values, matches my mind, and possesses the strength to create something entirely new. Ruth studied his weathered face, searching for any sign of self-deception or romantic delusion. What she found instead was the kind of clear-eyed certainty that came from hard experience honestly examined. But what about all the doubts people have raised? She asked. What about my lack of social skills, my inadequacy as a hostess, my complete inexperience with the kinds of responsibilities that come with being your wife? Sarah had no more experience with ranch life than you do, Thaddeus replied. She was a schoolteacher's daughter from a small farming community. What made her suitable wasn't her background or training, it was her willingness to learn, her genuine interest in understanding, her commitment to building something meaningful together. He drew her closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone reserved for shared confidences. Ruth, I've built a successful ranch through 12 years of hard work and careful planning. I don't need a wife who already knows everything about my business. I need a partner intelligent enough to learn what matters, practical enough to contribute meaningfully, and strong enough to stand beside me through whatever challenges we might face. The photograph, Ruth said suddenly, understanding striking her with surprising force. You carry it not because you're living in the past, but because it reminds you of what you're looking for in the future. Exactly, Thaddeus confirmed. Sarah taught me to recognize the difference between surface attractions and lasting value. She showed me what real partnership could look like. Losing her was devastating, but it also clarified my understanding of what I needed to build a meaningful life. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath as Ruth processed this revelation. The threats and social pressure that had seemed so overwhelming suddenly appeared in a different light. This wasn't about a lonely man making desperate choices or a plain woman receiving charity from someone too kind to reject her. This was about two people who understood each other's worth because they'd learned to value substance over style, character over convention, authentic connection over social approval. Judge Whitmore tells me that your father was quite surprised by your choice of career, Ruth said, testing her new understanding. A banker's son becoming a cattle rancher must have raised eyebrows in Denver society. Thaddeus smiled, recognizing her perceptive observation. My father wanted me to follow him into banking, to build wealth through financial manipulation rather than honest labor. Sarah helped me understand that I needed to create something with my own hands, to build success that reflected my values rather than merely my ambitions. And now you're asking me to help you continue building that life, Ruth said, wonder creeping into her voice. I'm asking you to build it with me, Thaddeus corrected, not as my assistant or ornament, but as my partner, someone whose intelligence and strength complement my own, whose vision helps shape our shared future. As they sat together in the garden, the faded photograph tucked safely back into his vest pocket, Ruth felt the last of her doubts beginning to dissolve. This wasn't about replacing someone lost or accepting whatever attention she could receive. This was about two people who had learned to see clearly, choosing to build something beautiful together. The transformation in Ruth, following Thaddeus's revelation, was subtle but unmistakable. Where once she had moved through social situations with the careful self-consciousness of someone expecting criticism, she now carried herself with quiet dignity that spoke of newfound understanding about her own worth. The change didn't escape notice in a town where every aspect of the unusual courtship had become a source of fascination and speculation. Ruth's wedding dress began taking shape in the quiet hours of late evening, sewn by her own hands with meticulous attention to detail that reflected both her practical nature and her growing confidence in her choices. She had declined her mother's offer to commission an elaborate gown from the territorial capital, choosing instead to create something that truly represented herself, rather than attempting to transform into someone else's idea of a proper bride. The fabric was simple cream-colored silk, elegant in its restraint rather than ostentatious in its decoration. Ruth had selected the material after careful consideration, choosing quality over flash, durability over fashion. The design emphasized clean lines and classic proportions that would remain beautiful long after current trends had faded, much like the marriage she intended to build with Thaddeus. Each evening, as she worked on the dress by lamplight, Ruth found herself reflecting on how profoundly her understanding of herself had changed. The needle pulling thread through silk became a meditation on patience and precision, on creating something beautiful through careful attention to details that others might overlook. She was no longer trying to become someone else. She was finally becoming fully herself. The wedding preparations revealed the depth of opposition they still faced. Several prominent families had declined their invitations with polite excuses that fooled no one, while others accepted with the kind of morbid curiosity that anticipated witnessing a spectacular mistake. Mrs. Patterson had appointed herself unofficial chronicler of what she predicted would be Cedar Falls' most regrettable wedding, sharing her gloomy prognostications with anyone willing to listen. "Mark my words," she told the gathered ladies at the quilting circle, "that poor man will realize his error before the ink dries on the marriage certificate. Ruth Whitmore might be a perfectly adequate spinster, but she has no business trying to be a cattle baron's wife. The whole situation is headed for disaster." These predictions reached Ruth's ears through the intricate network of small-town gossip, but rather than crushing her spirit as they once might have, they now served to strengthen her resolve. She had learned to distinguish between observations based on truth and opinions rooted in prejudice, and she recognized Mrs. Patterson's comments as falling firmly into the latter category. More troubling were the business complications beginning to affect Thaddeus's operations. Several potential contracts for cattle sales had been mysteriously withdrawn, with explanations that seemed suspiciously vague. Partners, who had initially welcomed his presence in the territory, now seemed reluctant to associate themselves with someone whose judgment they questioned. "It's nothing that can't be overcome," Thaddeus assured Ruth during one of their evening conversations, though she could see the concern in his weathered features. "Business relationships built on social approval rather than mutual benefit aren't worth maintaining anyway. The strong partnerships will survive this temporary foolishness." His confidence wasn't entirely feigned, but Ruth understood that the financial pressures added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation. She found herself studying agricultural journals and business publications with increased intensity, preparing herself to be genuinely helpful rather than merely decorative in their shared enterprise. The confrontation with her sisters came to a head 3 weeks before the planned wedding, during what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner. Lydia, who had maintained a facade of gracious acceptance for weeks, finally abandoned all pretense of sisterly support. "Ruth, I simply cannot stand by and watch you make such a terrible mistake," she announced, her beautiful face flushed with genuine distress. "You're going to embarrass yourself, embarrass our family, and destroy a good man's reputation in the process. This entire engagement has been a fantasy that's gone entirely too far." Anne joined the attack with characteristic precision. "We all understand that Mr. Gray's attention has been flattering, But surely you can see that accepting his proposal is nothing short of selfish. You know you're not equipped for this role, and you know that continuing this charade will hurt everyone involved. Margaret attempted a gentler approach, but her words carried no less sting for their diplomatic wrapping. What my sisters mean is that we're concerned about your happiness, Ruth. Marriage requires certain social and domestic skills that take years to develop. Perhaps it would be kinder to everyone if you allowed Mr. Gray to find someone better suited to his needs. For a moment, Ruth felt the familiar urge to shrink from confrontation, to apologize for presuming above her station and quietly remove herself from a situation that made others uncomfortable. But then she thought of Thaddeus's unwavering certainty about her worth, of Sarah's photograph and the lessons about authentic value that had shaped his understanding, of the wedding dress taking shape through her own careful work. "No," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. "I will not step aside to make others more comfortable with their own assumptions about worth and suitability." She stood slowly, her posture reflecting newfound dignity rather than defensive defiance. "Lydia, you are beautiful, charming, and accomplished in all the ways that society values. But those qualities have not made you happy, nor have they attracted the kind of lasting partnership that you claim to want. Perhaps the problem is not that Mr. Gray chose wrongly, but that you have been measuring value by the wrong standards." Lydia's mouth opened in shock at this unprecedented challenge from her previously submissive sister. Ruth continued with gathering confidence. "Anne, your wit and intelligence are genuine gifts, but you have used them primarily to tear down rather than build up, to demonstrate your superiority rather than create meaningful connections. Mr. Gray values intelligence that serves constructive purposes, not clever cruelty disguised as sophistication." Anne's sharp retort died unspoken as the accuracy of Ruth's observation struck home. "And Margaret," Ruth said, turning to her most diplomatic sister, "your grace and accomplishments are real and valuable, but they have become ends in themselves rather than means to deeper purposes. You have learned to manage social situations perfectly while avoiding any risk of genuine vulnerability or authentic connection." The parlor fell silent as Ruth's family absorbed this unprecedented analysis from someone they had always considered the least perceptive member of their household. "Mr. Gray chose me," Ruth continued, "not because I am perfect or because he has settled for less than he deserves, but because he recognizes that real partnership is built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine compatibility rather than social performance. I am not trying to be someone else. I am finally learning to be fully myself." Judge Whitmore, who had watched this exchange with growing amazement, found his voice at last. "Ruth, I must say that I have never heard you speak with such clarity and conviction. Perhaps Mr. Gray's confidence in your character is better founded than any of us realized." The admission represented a profound shift in family dynamics that had been years in the making. Ruth had finally claimed her place as an equal rather than accepting the role of grateful afterthought that had defined her entire life. Mrs. Whitmore, ever the peacemaker, attempted to restore family harmony. "I think what we all want is for Ruth to be happy and secure in her marriage. Mr. Gray's devotion seems genuine, and perhaps we have been too quick to assume that conventional suitability is the only path to marital success." The conversation marked a turning point in how Ruth's family viewed both her and her engagement. While questions and concerns remained, they could no longer dismiss her choice as naive self-deception or Thaddeus's interest as temporary infatuation. As the family retired for the evening, Ruth returned to her sewing with renewed purpose. Each stitch in her wedding dress now carried additional meaning, not just preparation for a ceremony, but affirmation of her right to choose her own path and create her own definition of happiness. The dress, like the woman who made it, was becoming something beautiful through patience, skill, and unwavering commitment to authentic self-expression. In 3 weeks, Ruth would walk down the aisle, wearing a gown that represented everything she had learned about the difference between surface beauty and lasting worth. But first, she and Thaddeus would have to survive the final tests that their unconventional love would face from a community still determined to prove them wrong. The morning of Ruth's wedding dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to promise either perfect happiness or perfect disaster, depending on one's perspective. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of her bedroom, casting intricate patterns across the cream silk wedding dress that hung like a declaration of quiet rebellion against every expectation Cedar Falls had held about its plainest daughter. Ruth woke before dawn, not from nervousness, but from an anticipation so profound it made sleep impossible. Today she would marry Thaddeus Gray, not because she had transformed herself into someone worthy of his attention, but because she had finally learned to recognize the worth that had always existed within her. The distinction mattered more than anyone who hadn't lived 19 years as an afterthought could possibly understand. Downstairs, Mrs. Whitmore supervised breakfast preparations with the focused intensity of a general planning a crucial campaign. Every detail had been considered and reconsidered, from the placement of flowers to the timing of the ceremony, as if perfect execution could somehow shield her daughter from the continued skepticism of their community. "Ruth needs to eat something substantial," she instructed the cook, though her own stomach churned with anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger. "This will be a long day, and she mustn't appear wan during the ceremony." The truth was that Mrs. Whitmore remained profoundly uncertain about this marriage, despite her growing respect for Thaddeus's character and her daughter's newfound confidence. Love matches were romantic in theory, but risky in practice, particularly when they challenged social conventions as boldly as this union promised to do. Judge Whitmore found himself in his study earlier than usual, ostensibly reviewing legal documents, but actually contemplating the magnitude of what would transpire in a few short hours. His youngest daughter, the one he had quietly assumed would remain a spinster devoted to books and intellectual pursuits, would marry one of the territory's most successful businessmen. The irony wasn't lost on him that Ruth's supposed disadvantages might prove to be precisely the qualities that ensured her happiness. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression thoughtful rather than troubled. "Father, may I speak with you about Ruth?" "Of course, my dear. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what she said to us the other night, about measuring value by the wrong standards. She was right, wasn't she? We've all been so concerned with what Mr. Gray was giving up by choosing her that we never considered what he might be gaining." Judge Whitmore studied his second youngest daughter's face, noting the genuine reflection rather than defensive justification. "I believe you may be correct. Ruth possesses qualities that we've taken for granted because they don't announce themselves dramatically. Perhaps Mr. Gray's success in business comes partly from his ability to recognize value that others overlook." Meanwhile, in the hotel across town, Thaddeus performed his own morning ritual with the calm precision of someone who had learned to trust his decisions completely. He had awakened thinking not about the social complications or business pressures that this marriage might bring, but about the profound relief of finally finding someone with whom he could build a life based on authentic partnership rather than social obligation. The silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father lay open on the nightstand, its steady ticking marking the passage of time toward a future that would honor both past lessons and present possibilities. Beside it, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, lay his father's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had symbolized a marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic idealization. Thaddeus had decided to offer Ruth this ring not as a replacement for something newer and more elaborate, but as a symbol of the kind of lasting partnership he hoped to create with her. His parents had enjoyed 43 years of marriage, characterized by genuine affection, intellectual companionship, and unwavering support through the inevitable challenges that tested every union. Their example had shaped his understanding of what marriage could become when both parties valued substance over style. Back at the Whitmore mansion, Ruth's sisters gathered in her bedroom for the traditional pre-wedding preparations, though the atmosphere carried undertones of reconciliation rather than celebration. The confrontation from the previous week had cleared the air of years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding, leaving space for more honest communication than they had shared since childhood. Lydia, still struggling to comprehend how her plain sister had captured the attention that she herself had sought, approached with tentative olive branch. "Ruth, I want to apologize for some of the things I've said during your engagement. I think I was more jealous than concerned, and that's not worthy of me or fair to you." The admission represented a significant step toward maturity for someone who had rarely questioned her own assumptions about value and desirability. Anne followed with characteristic directness. "I still think this marriage is unusual, but I'm beginning to understand that unusual doesn't necessarily mean wrong. Mr. Gray seems to appreciate qualities in you that I never learned to value properly." Margaret, ever the diplomat, attempted to bridge any remaining gaps. "What matters is that you love each other and share compatible visions for your future together. The rest is just social noise that will fade once people find new topics for gossip." As Ruth's sisters helped her into the wedding dress she had sewn with such painstaking care, she felt the weight of family relationships shifting towards something healthier and more authentic. The gown fit perfectly, its clean lines and quality construction creating an impression of understated elegance that enhanced rather than masked her natural appearance. "You look beautiful," Margaret said with genuine warmth. "Not like someone trying to be beautiful, but like someone who simply is." The distinction captured exactly what Ruth had learned about herself through Thaddeus's patient attention and unwavering confidence. She wasn't trying to transform into someone worthy of love. She was finally allowing herself to be loved as herself. Judge Whitmore appeared in the doorway, his formal morning coat lending appropriate gravity to his role in the day's proceedings. The sight of his daughter in her wedding dress struck him with unexpected emotion, not because she looked different than usual, but because she looked so completely like herself, confident, thoughtful, and ready to embrace a future that she had chosen rather than simply accepted. "Ruth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal pride and lingering amazement, "you are a vision of quiet dignity. Mr. Gray is indeed fortunate to have won your affection." The carriage ride to the church passed in contemplative silence, each family member lost in private thoughts about marriages, choices, and the unexpected ways that love sometimes revealed itself. Ruth found herself thinking not about the ceremony itself, but about the partnership that would begin when the formal proceedings ended, the shared work of building a life that honored both individual worth and mutual commitment. At the church, guests had already begun gathering with the mixture of genuine goodwill and morbid curiosity that characterized most small-town social events. Some came hoping to witness the triumph of true love over social convention, others expecting to see a spectacular mistake in progress. But all came, drawn by the unprecedented nature of this union between the territory's most eligible bachelor and its most overlooked maiden. As Ruth stepped from the carriage and saw the church where she had worshipped since childhood, she felt the weight of community attention, but also the strength that came from knowing exactly why she was here and what she hoped to accomplish. Today wasn't about proving anything to Cedar Falls or silencing her critics. Today was about marrying a man who saw her clearly and chose her completely, beginning a partnership that would be built on authentic understanding rather than romantic illusion. The interior of Cedar Falls Community Church had been transformed by Mrs. Whitmore's careful attention to detail, though the decorations reflected Ruth's preference for understated elegance rather than ostentatious display. White roses and baby's breath created simple arrangements that complemented, rather than competed, with the natural beauty of the wooden sanctuary, while soft candlelight added warmth to the afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Thaddeus stood at the altar with his best man, his ranch foreman, Samuel Torres, a weathered Mexican-American who had worked beside him for 8 years and understood better than most the significance of this moment. Samuel had witnessed his employer's gradual retreat from social connections following Sarah's death, his increasing isolation despite professional success, and his recent transformation back into someone capable of hope and partnership. "She's good for you, Jefe," Samuel had observed the night before, using the Spanish term of respect that reflected their easy working relationship. "I haven't seen you this settled since before Colorado. A man needs more than cattle and land to make a full life." As guests settled into the wooden pews, the social divisions of Cedar Falls became clearly visible. The front rows held family members and close friends who genuinely wished the couple well, while the middle sections accommodated those who came from curiosity or social obligation. The back pews were populated by townspeople who expected to witness either a miraculous transformation or a spectacular mistake, depending on their perspective. Mrs. Patterson had positioned herself strategically, where she could observe everything while maintaining the pretense of respectful attendance. Her running commentary, delivered in stage whispers to her long-suffering husband, provided ongoing analysis of the proceedings. "Well, I must admit Ruth looks better than expected," she conceded grudgingly. "That dress is actually quite becoming, though I still maintain this entire situation is headed for disaster. Mark my words, Herbert, we'll be attending another ceremony within 2 years when Mr. Gray comes to his senses." Reverend Thompson took his position at the altar with the satisfied air of someone about to preside over a union that challenged conventional wisdom while affirming deeper truths about love and partnership. His conversations with both bride and groom had convinced him that this marriage was built on foundations more solid than social approval or romantic infatuation. The moment arrived with the opening notes of the processional, played with genuine skill by Margaret on the church's pump organ. The melody she had chosen, Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, filled the sanctuary with music that spoke of lasting joy rather than temporary celebration, setting exactly the tone Ruth had hoped for. Anne walked down the aisle first as maid of honor, her natural grace serving the occasion well, despite her lingering bewilderment at her sister's transformation. She had chosen her role in the wedding as an act of family loyalty, but found herself genuinely moved by the significance of what she was witnessing. Then Ruth appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, and the church fell completely silent. The simple cream silk dress she had sewn herself created an impression of timeless elegance that transcended fashion or trend. Her brown hair, arranged in a style that enhanced rather than disguised its natural texture, framed a face that glowed with quiet confidence rather than nervous excitement. But it was her expression that silenced even the skeptics, the look of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and why she was there. This wasn't a woman accepting whatever attention she could receive, but someone choosing a future that honored her authentic self. Thaddeus felt his breath catch as Ruth began her walk toward him, not because she looked different than usual, but because she looked so completely herself, intelligent, genuine, and ready to build something meaningful together. The unity candle that waited on the altar beside them had been Ruth's suggestion, a symbol of 2 lives merging while maintaining their individual worth and purpose. Judge Whitmore delivered his daughter with dignity that reflected his growing understanding of what this union represented. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Reverend Thompson asked, according to tradition. "Her mother and I do," Judge Whitmore replied, his voice carrying conviction that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. As he placed Ruth's hand in Thaddeus's, he whispered words meant for her alone. I'm proud of you, my dear. You've taught us all something important about courage and authenticity. The wedding vows that followed were traditional in structure, but profound in their delivery. When Thaddeus promised to honor and cherish Ruth through all the seasons of their shared life, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about what marriage could become when built on genuine partnership rather than social convenience. Ruth's voice remained steady as she pledged her love and commitment, speaking with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what she was promising and why it mattered. Her vows weren't performance, but declaration, a public affirmation of the partnership she and Thaddeus had already begun building through honest conversation and mutual respect. The exchange of rings created the ceremony's most poignant moment. When Thaddeus offered his father's simple gold band, explaining quietly that it represented 43 years of successful marriage built on authentic love, Ruth understood the honor being given her. This wasn't just jewelry, but legacy, an invitation to continue something meaningful rather than merely begin something new. With this ring, I thee wed, Thaddeus said, slipping the band onto Ruth's finger with reverence that made several guests reach for their handkerchiefs. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. Ruth's ring for Thaddeus was equally simple, a gold band she had selected for its clean lines and enduring style rather than ostentation or fashion. With this ring, I thee wed, she repeated, her voice carrying joy that transformed her entire face. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause that surprised everyone with its genuine warmth. Even the skeptics found themselves moved by what they had witnessed. Not a desperate union born of loneliness and low expectations, but a thoughtful partnership between two people who clearly understood and valued each other. The unity candle ceremony that followed provided the perfect conclusion to their vows. As Ruth and Thaddeus each lit a taper from separate flames, then together lit the central candle that would burn throughout their reception, the symbolism spoke to everyone present about the beauty of maintaining individual identity while creating something new together. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Ruth felt the weight of community attention, but also the strength that came from knowing she had married for the right reasons. The journey from overlooked daughter to confident bride hadn't required her to become someone else, it had required her to finally become fully herself. The receiving line that formed outside the church told its own story about shifting community perceptions. Congratulations came not just from those who had always supported the match, but from some who had initially questioned it, but now found themselves impressed by what they had witnessed. Even Mrs. Patterson managed a grudging compliment. Well, Ruth, I must say you carried yourself beautifully today. Perhaps there's more to this match than some of us initially understood. As they prepared to depart for their reception, Ruth and Thaddeus shared a private moment beside their carriage. How do you feel, Mrs. Gray? Thaddeus asked, using her new name for the first time. Like I'm exactly where I belong, Ruth replied, meaning it completely. 6 months after their wedding, Ruth stood on the wraparound porch of the ranch house that had become her home, watching the morning sun paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and rose. The vista stretched endlessly in all directions, 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, dotted with cattle that had thrived under the careful management that she and Thaddeus had refined together through long evenings of discussion and planning. In her hands, she held a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with observations, reflections, and plans written in both her careful script and Thaddeus's bolder handwriting. This new journal, begun on their wedding day, documented their shared life in ways that went far beyond mere record-keeping. It captured conversations about ranch improvements, thoughts on livestock breeding, observations about weather patterns, and dreams for their expanding operation. More importantly, it recorded the evolution of their partnership from tentative courtship to confident collaboration. Ruth had discovered that marriage to Thaddeus didn't require her to diminish herself to accommodate his needs, but rather to expand into the fullest expression of her capabilities. Her intelligence wasn't a liability to be hidden, but an asset to be deployed in service of their shared goals. The sound of hoofbeats announced Thaddeus's return from his morning inspection of the south pasture, where he'd been checking on a group of pregnant cows expected to calve within the week. Ruth had suggested implementing a rotation system that would allow closer monitoring during calving season, while preventing overgrazing of their best pasture land, an innovation that had already proven its worth through improved calf survival rates. "The Hendersons' fence line needs attention," Thaddeus called as he dismounted, referring to their nearest neighbors with the easy familiarity of someone discussing family concerns. "I thought we might ride over this afternoon and offer to help with repairs." Building good relationships with neighboring ranchers benefits everyone in the long run. This approach to community building reflected lessons Ruth had helped him understand about the importance of cooperation over competition in frontier society. Her natural diplomacy, once seen as social inadequacy, had proven invaluable in establishing the kind of positive relationships that made their operation more sustainable and secure. Inside the ranch house, evidence of Ruth's influence could be found in every room, though not in the ways that conventional wisdom might have predicted. The changes weren't decorative flourishes or domestic refinements, but practical improvements that made their home more functional and welcoming. The study where they planned ranch operations together featured maps and charts organized for easy reference, while the kitchen had been redesigned for efficiency rather than mere appearance. More significantly, the house had become a gathering place for neighboring families who appreciated the combination of genuine hospitality and intelligent conversation that Ruth and Thaddeus offered together. Their dinner parties weren't formal social performances, but authentic opportunities for community building, where local ranchers could discuss common challenges and share successful strategies. The transformation in Ruth's relationship with her family had been equally profound. Judge Whitmore, initially bewildered by his daughter's unexpected success, had become one of her strongest supporters as he witnessed the happiness and purpose she'd found in her new role. His letters to the ranch, arriving weekly, reflected genuine pride in her accomplishments and curiosity about the innovations she and Thaddeus continued to implement. Mrs. Whitmore's visits to the ranch had become treasured occasions that strengthened, rather than strained, family bonds. She had been amazed to discover that Ruth's domestic skills, once considered adequate at best, had flourished when applied to purposes she genuinely valued. Managing a ranch household required different talents than maintaining a town mansion, and Ruth's practical intelligence proved perfectly suited to the challenges involved. Even her sisters had begun to recognize the wisdom in Ruth's unconventional choice. Lydia, still unmarried despite numerous suitors, had started asking thoughtful questions about the foundations of lasting partnership rather than focusing solely on immediate attraction. Anne's wit had evolved from cutting commentary to more constructive humor that brought people together rather than driving them apart. Margaret had begun to question whether her pursuit of conventional accomplishments truly prepared her for meaningful adult relationships. The most satisfying vindication came through the ranch's continued success under their joint management. Cattle sales exceeded projections, breeding programs produced healthier livestock, and their reputation for ethical business practices attracted partners who valued integrity over quick profits. Ruth's suggestions for diversification had led to successful experiments with sheep and horses that provided additional revenue streams while utilizing pasture land more efficiently. More importantly, their partnership had created something neither could have achieved alone, a life built on authentic understanding and shared purpose rather than social obligation or romantic fantasy. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions of agricultural innovation to philosophical reflections on building meaningful lives, creating intellectual intimacy that deepened rather than diminished over time. The journal in Ruth's hands contained evidence of this evolution on every page. Early entries recorded tentative suggestions and careful observations as she learned the practical aspects of ranch management. Recent pages showed confident analysis and bold recommendations that reflected her growing expertise and Thaddeus's complete trust in her judgment. As Thaddeus joined her on the porch, settling into the chair beside hers with the comfortable ease of someone who had found exactly where he belonged, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The transformation hadn't required her to become someone else, but had allowed her to become more fully herself than ever before. "What are you thinking about?" Thaddeus asked, noting the contemplative expression that he had learned to associate with her most valuable insights. "About worth," Ruth replied, closing the journal carefully. "About how we learn to recognize it in ourselves and others. About how easily we can mistake surface attractions for deeper value, and how much we can miss when we judge by conventional standards." She turned to face him, her expression carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced her old self-doubt. "I'm grateful that you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, but I'm even more grateful that you helped me learn to see it too. That's the real gift you gave me, not your love, but the understanding that I was worthy of it." Thaddeus reached for her hand, noting the simple wedding ring that had belonged to his parents and now symbolized their own commitment to building something lasting and meaningful. "We gave each other that gift," he corrected gently. "You taught me that taking risks on what truly matters is always worthwhile, even when others question your judgment." As they sat together watching the sun climb higher over their shared domain, Ruth opened the journal to a fresh page. Today would bring new challenges, opportunities, and decisions that would shape their continuing story. But she no longer approached the future with uncertainty or self-doubt. She had learned, finally and completely, that real love doesn't ask us to become different people, but helps us become the best versions of ourselves. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we find someone willing to build that better life alongside us, page by carefully written page.